All right, we're going to be in the book of Genesis, chapter number 40 this morning. Genesis chapter number 40, although we are going to back up and read the last few verses of Genesis chapter 39. So if you'll find chapter 40, that's where we'll spend most of our time. But I do want to back up to verse number 20 of Genesis 39. The Bible tells us that and Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with him, was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. And sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants, and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed a cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for a great opportunity to be able to worship together, to read your word, Lord, to have it explained to us, applied to our lives. And God, I pray that you'd help us as we think about the things that are happening to Joseph here. God, that you would just help us to follow from his example, to learn things that will help us in our lives, situations we're facing. And God, that you'd be glorified and honored through what is said, and that we would remember your glory above all else. First, in your Son's precious name we ask these things. Amen. I'm going to share with you just a little bit about one of the most miserable times in my life, but I need you to be careful with what I'm about to say. Now, I know the obvious thing to say to me is, Brother Daniel, remember that you are being streamed right now, so don't say things that will get you in trouble. Well, I'm going to say some things, but I don't think it'll get me in trouble because I think it's going to be honest. And I think if you were to ask the person that I'm about to talk about, he would be able to verify some things that I'm about to say. And you'll have an opportunity in just a couple weeks, and you'll understand that in just a moment. But the most miserable time of my life was shortly after being hired to be the associate pastor at Meadowbrook Church in Black Mountain. The year was 2014. And I say you have an opportunity because Brother Randy is going to come preach for us in 2 weeks as I'm going on vacation. So don't mention this to him unless he asks, because Daniel said anything about me, okay? But if he goes back and watches this, I'm sure that he will understand where I'm coming from. And I was miserable for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was that Brother Randy and I could not be any more opposite in our nature. Brother Randy is very direct. I'm very indirect. Brother Randy is very detail-oriented, and I'm very not detail-oriented. But I was also miserable because I had accepted a position doing things that I wasn't great at doing. And don't misinterpret what I'm about to say, but to say that I think I'm a great preacher, because I don't think that's the case. But I think if God's called me to do anything, it's that He's called me to preach His Word. And I love preaching. I enjoy the process, the studying, the putting the sermons together, the actual process of preaching. I enjoy that, but I wasn't getting an opportunity to preach because that's not what I'd been hired to do. And Brother Randy is one of the hardest working pastors I've ever been around in my life. And I'm not saying that I'm not a hard-working pastor, because I don't think that to be the case, but I think I am the worker I am today because of Brother Randy. He was dedicated to the things that he had been called to do. And part of the job requirements that he had for me was that I gave him a report at the end of every week of everything I had done that week, including the amount of hours that I had worked. And the amount of hours I was supposed to work, I couldn't find enough stuff to do to fit in that time. And so there would be days, including a lot of Saturdays, that I'd be sitting in my office stewing over the fact that the only reason I'm here is so I can write down on a piece of paper that I was in this office. And that was the only reason that I was there. And I was miserable. I got to the place where as soon as the amen was said on Sunday morning, I was finding a door to get out of there. That I hated getting up and going into the office because I wasn't passionate about being there. And I have grown to love and respect Brother Randy. I'll be honest, I don't want to work for him. And he doesn't want me to work for him. We're just fine with the way the relationship is now. But as I look back on that time in my life, I honestly regret the way that I handled that. I don't regret going. I think I learned a lot of good things, but I think I missed out on a lot of things that I could have learned. And I'll be honest to say that I almost missed out on coming to be the pastor here, and you may have wished that I would have. But because the way our relationship was and the way I handled that situation, I couldn't see myself being in the same association with Brother Randy or seeing the people from the church there because of just the shame I felt over the way that I handled that job. And I look back and I see just so much I missed out on. I feel like I could be a better pastor to you today had I been a better associate for Brother Randy then, and had I done what the title of the message is today and decided to just bloom where God had planted me for that period of time. And I know that that is a cliche statement, to bloom where you're planted, but it fits very well with the passage we're looking at today, because I believe all of us are forced at different times in our lives to make a decision about whether or not we're going to make the best of the situations that God has us in at the current moment. Now, it may not be a job situation for you. It may be something entirely different. It could be a health situation. It could be financial. It could be relationally. There's so many different circumstances in life that could cause us to be miserable. And where we have an option, an opportunity, am I going to make the best of this opportunity, or am I going to waste it by being miserable, by focusing too much on things that I cannot control, by becoming bitter and angry over the things that God has allowed to come into my life? And I believe Joseph is a great example of how you and I can take on every opportunity, every circumstance in life, and make the best of it. The first thing I'd like to show you from Joseph's life in learning how to become, to bloom where we're planted, is by simply learning to focus on what we can control. Learning to focus on what we can control. I believe there's a natural tendency in all of us. I do believe that certain generational things may allow this to be a little differently. But I believe we all have a natural tendency to focus on things that we have no control over. And even good things that we have no control over sometimes can become a distraction. Some random blessing that has come our way that we had nothing to do with. We can be so overjoyed, elated, and excited that that's all we're focusing on are these good things that are happening, and we're letting other things go by the wayside. But more often, it's those difficult circumstances, the tragic news that we've received, being unfairly terminated by some relationship that has fallen apart. Some person has taken advantage of us and abused us. And we focus so much on the pain that situation is causing us, and it distracts us from just doing what we can while we can and where God has placed us. So let's look here at the circumstances that Joseph is facing that I believe will help us to learn this lesson. If you would go back with me to chapter number 39, beginning there in verse number 22. It tells us that the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. So Joseph finds himself in prison because he has been falsely accused of an attempted sexual assault. And Potiphar, which was his boss, which was also the accuser's husband, decides to put Joseph into prison to pay for the crime that he did not commit. We have no way of knowing how long Joseph was supposed to be there. But what we do know about the way that Joseph treated his time there is that through his attitude and through his actions, he gained the trust of those that were overseeing him. In other words, what I mean is they did not fear that if we put Joseph in charge of the prisoners, that he's going to be involved in trying to revolt and overthrow the prison. The guards did not fear that if Joseph was given this extra liberty, that they would come in one day to find out that Joseph has disappeared, he's escaped. Through his actions and through his attitude, he said, I'm somebody that can be trusted to do what is right. I'm somebody that can be trusted to do what is expected of me in this situation. And because of that, they decided to put him in charge of overseeing the prisoners, and the person in charge of him had nothing to worry about. Didn't even have to think about what was going on in the prison because Joseph was there. Now, if we skip down into chapter number 40, I want to point out to you this. Verse number 2 tells us that Pharaoh was angry with the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he puts them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. Now, who was the captain of the guard? The captain of the guard was Potiphar. That's what chapter number 39 tells us. The husband of the one who accused Joseph of sexual assault. The one who, as a result of that, decided to take away what liberty Joseph had and imprisoned him. But notice what verse number 4 tells us. That the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So the man who put Joseph in prison had closely examined the life of Joseph as he was in prison and decided that he was trustworthy enough to put him in charge of these two important inmates in the baker and the butler of the king. As we're going to find out, one of them was not guilty, so you can imagine the result of Joseph not taking good care of these two important men. But yet Joseph had lived his life in such a way that said, Potiphar, you imprisoned me, but you can trust me. I'm going to do a good job. You see, Joseph could not allow himself to be focused on getting justice because that was outside of his control. He couldn't focus on getting out of prison, although he wanted to. And you can see as he says to the cupbearer, when you get out, remember me. Trying to secure my release. He couldn't focus on that because it was outside of his control. He couldn't focus on getting revenge on Potiphar's wife because it was outside of his control. He couldn't focus on how unfair it was that he was in prison because it was outside of his control. All he could do was focus on what he could control. And that was his actions, and that was his attitude. I used to get really upset when my favorite sport team would lose. And they shall not be named today. Happens far more frequently than I like. I would get so upset to where the whole next day was pretty much a waste. I didn't want to see anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to listen to the radio. I didn't want to watch TV. And if you mentioned it to me, more than likely you were going to get some kind of sarcastic, snarky remark back. Because I hated losing. Hated it. But one day something dawned on me, and it was probably a comment that Miss Camille made to me. That I had absolutely nothing to do with them losing. Nothing at all. And when they win, I had nothing at all to do with their winning. I wasn't on the court or the field, not playing hard enough, not giving enough effort, making not smart plays. I wasn't on the sidelines calling the plays, calling the timeouts, making the substitutions. I wasn't involved in formulating that team together. I couldn't improve it in the off season. I couldn't show up at practice the next day to make sure they ran enough to pay for the misery I felt because they lost. I couldn't do any of that. So why am I miserable over something I had nothing to do with? You know, that's a silly illustration. It's, excuse my language, but it is dumb for me to be frustrated to that degree because they lost. But the reality of it is, for many of us, we often spend our lives in misery over things that we cannot control. Now, I know as you're listening to this, if you think anything like me, and that might be scary for you, I'm quick when I hear that my circumstances are outside of my control to say, well, wait a minute. If I hadn't have done this, then that wouldn't have happened to me. That if I would only do a better job of doing these things, then the circumstances over here that are miserable are going to be changed. It just has to be, right? But if I could respond by asking you a couple of questions this morning, and the first one would be, do you have any control over that family member, that friend, that neighbor who you're in a relationship spat with? Do you have any control over their behavior? Now, I know you'd like to say, I sure wish I did, but we don't. In fact, it's not surprising to me that you could say, Brother Daniel, I have done everything right, 100% in this relationship. I have loved them well. I have been there for them. I have sacrificed. I have done what I should do in this relationship, and they won't change. And that's because we can't control that. What God has called us to do is to do our part in the relationship regardless of whether or not they change. Now, how many of us are motivated to do that when we don't think there's going to be change? So if our motivation is them changing, we're focusing on what we can't control. Do you really have any control over whether somebody's going to give you a job or not? Or allow you to keep the job that you have? No. You could be the best employee possible and still not get hired or get fired. Unless you work for yourself, you have no control over that. Then if you work for yourself, you have no control over who's going to hire you to do those things that you're doing for yourself. Nobody really works for themselves. Unless you're retired, and then maybe. And if you're not, never mind. So the only thing that we can control is by being the best possible worker that we can be. Can I tell you that it is a lot better, it's much better for you to be the best employee to ever walk the face of the earth and be unemployed than it is to be a lazy, ungrateful, with the worst attitude and work ethic and still be unemployed. Because you can't control who employs you. Do you have control whether or not people like you? No. All you can do is be the best version of you that God has called you to do. Do you have any control over what your health is going to do? No. We all know people who are the picture-perfect example of health that we would all like to emulate our lives after, wish we had the discipline they did, drop dead of a heart attack, or get some dreaded disease that takes their life. Absolutely no control over that. The only thing we can do is we can try to eat healthy, but I don't know that a long life is worth the sacrifice of eating healthy all the time, do you? Sounds pretty miserable to me. We can try to exercise. We can try to get some sleep. We can try to limit our stress. We can do those things. But at the end of the day, it has nothing in regards to true control over our health. See, we have a choice to make. When difficult circumstances come our way, am I going to focus on the part of it that I cannot control? Or am I going to be like Joseph, who said, man, I'm in prison. It's unfair. It's not just. I don't deserve to be here. In fact, I wish I was back with my family, where I should have been all along? Where am I going to wake up every day and with God's help have a good attitude about it and try to do the best job you can and let the rest take care of itself? I can't promise you that if you focus on what you control that it's going to get better. Because if that's what you're allowing to be the motivation, then you're, again, focusing on what you cannot control. But what I can tell you is that your life is going to experience so much more peace. And you're going to come out on the other side of it in such a better place. Even if that's heaven. Because you just focus on what you could control. There's a second aspect to this. And it's a result of us focusing on what we control. And that is the level of concern that we have for the well-being of others. I think we see this by the way that Joseph interacts with these two prisoners. And I think our natural tendency when we're going through a tragic time is to turn the focus and the attention upon ourselves and the tragedy that we're facing. When we're talking with people we love and care about, when we're seeing new friends, it's like no matter what's going on in their lives, we always want to draw the attention back to what we're feeling and what we're experiencing. I know your life's miserable, but it can't be as miserable as mine. So let's talk about my pain for just a moment. Because that's how we are. But when we are focusing on what we can control, it allows us to be able to see the things that other people are going through. So let's look at this interaction. So the baker and the butler are in prison. Now the baker in charge of the king's food, the butler in charge of the king's drink had to be trusted positions. Because if there was going to be an assassination attempt, that's one of the easiest ways to do it, is to slip poison into the food or the drink, the king's dead. So if an enemy could pay off one of them, get to the king that way, that may be what has happened here. That there's a plot to assassinate the king, and he doesn't know who, whether the butler or the baker, but he knows how. It's going to be poison. So he throws them both into prison. And they are there with Joseph, and they've been there for some time. And I want you to notice what happens there beginning in verse number 6. Basically, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but if you'll look there so you know I'm not paraphrasing it incorrectly. One morning, Joseph is checking in on them. Maybe he's bringing them some breakfast. Maybe he's just making sure that they're still there, that there's nothing wrong with them. And he notices that something seems a little off with them. Now, would Joseph have noticed that if he had spent all night complaining about a situation? But he notices the fact that they seem down in disposition, that they're sad. Something's wrong with them. They're troubled. And so he asked them, verse number 7, guys, why are you so sad? Now, I don't know about you, but if I was the butler or the baker, and Joseph asked me why I'm sad, I'd say, look around you, dude. I'm in prison. What do you think's wrong? But they avoided that opportunity for sarcasm. They said, man, we had some crazy dreams last night. Things that we just don't understand. We don't know how it applies. We don't know the meaning of it, and it's got us worried. Obviously, a different culture around dreams in that day than ours, and we won't take the time to get in there to discuss that this morning. But notice what happens in verse number 8 at the end of that. Joseph's response to them is, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Now let me paraphrase this for you. Joseph goes in, hey guys, what's wrong? Something seems off with you today. Man, we've had some weird dreams. We don't understand the meaning of it. And having his own experience with some weird dreams and significant meanings, Joseph said, hey, I can help you with that. I know somebody that can help us find the meaning of it. Again, in my flesh, if I'm Joseph, why am I going to help them? They are Egyptians after all. They are the ones who have enslaved him. And Joseph's about to tell one of them, hey, you're going free in 3 days. Now, the other one, unfortunately, doesn't get the same kind of good news. Instead, he says, 3 days, you'll be dead. Sometimes, God calls us to give some not so great news to people, but we can still help them if they'll turn away from that and move on from it. But I believe that Joseph's attitude about his situation allowed him to see the circumstances the other person was facing. And as I was studying this, I read this quote by David Guzik, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He writes, when we are consumed with anger and bitterness, we don't often take concern with the personal problems of others. And that statement hit me right between the eyes. Because so often I spend, and let's be honest, I'm saying I, but it's really a we thing here. We spend so much time and energy on our problems that we miss opportunities to be a help, to be an encouragement, to lighten a load for someone else. I'll give you an illustration of this, and it's going to seem like I'm going to come out the hero in this illustration, but I'll be honest by saying up front that this doesn't happen nearly as often as I'd like it to. A few weeks ago, the boss that I work for there at Inc. Intermediate School asked me to come in an hour early for the last 2 weeks of school so that I could take one kid home before all the other kids get to go home. The kid was getting out at 2 o'clock. And what I wanted to say is, dude, do you know how busy I am? I'm not doing this because I don't have anything else to do. I say no a lot to offers such as this. And you want me to stop my day an hour early so that I can come into school and take one kid home who can't get along with everybody else on the bus. Well, I said, I say no a lot. It's only 2 weeks, so I'll do it. Last Monday, as I was rushing into the school to go clock in for that day, I walked into the break room where our computer is that we clocked in, and there was a lady that was sitting there. I've never seen this lady in this break room ever. Ever. I had not talked to this lady since the second week of school, which was, a long time ago. And there she was sitting in the same room that I walked into. I walked over there to clock in. And normally what I do, hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Going about my day. But I felt something inside of me that I believe was God's Spirit prompting me to start talking to her. I knew her mom was elderly, moved up from Florida. So I said, hey, how's your mom doing? Oh, she's doing good. Settling in, things of that nature. And then I said, are you coming back next year? Suddenly her disposition changed. And she said, no, they let me go. Now she's a single lady. Her mom has just moved to be with her. She's taking care of her. Teachers in public schools, decent but not great pay. Probably not getting paid during the summer. She's taken this position. She loved it. She liked being there. Enjoyed teaching. Thought she was coming back for another year. And she got told, I'm sorry, we don't have a position for you. And I could just tell that she was distraught. I knew she was a new Christian. I'd found that out in the second week of school. She became a believer in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Started going to church, had never really been in church before in her life. And so another thought hit me. Daniel, this is a new believer. She probably doesn't know about Joseph. And I've been preaching through the life of Joseph. And just, not the Sunday before, but the Sunday before that, I shared an illustration about Brother Taylor going through a very similar situation. So I asked her, have you ever heard about Joseph? I'm preaching through Joseph. And Joseph faced some circumstances that were not his fault, things that he was not expecting. And I used Brother Taylor's words. I told her about his story, that it turned out being the best thing that ever happened to me. And I was able to, from that story and through Joseph's story, to be able to say, look, I know this is distressing. I know this is disheartening, but just trust the Lord. He knew this was going to happen before you even became a believer. He's going to take care of you. Again, I wish I could say that I do that on a daily basis. But I would be safe in saying that far more often, I'm so focused on the fact that I got to get into that hot bus and drive that kid home, that I miss the discouraged, precious new believer in the midst of a very trying, difficult circumstance, and walk out and miss out on that opportunity to encourage her. But don't look at me like I'm some bad person, because the reality is you do too. The reality is we all do. Miss out on opportunities. I've got to hurry up. So let me share the last thing with you quickly. What can we do to bloom where we're planted? Focus on what we can control. Be concerned about the needs of others. But then, the third thing, although it's not the least important, is to just keep trusting Jesus. Joseph had experienced God's blessing in the circumstances of being sold into slavery in Egypt. But despite that, he got promoted to a very high position that gave him some level of freedom and comfort, only to have it all stripped away from him. But in chapter 39, in verse number 21, we're reminded, but the Lord was with Joseph. I don't have any doubts in my mind this morning that Joseph was well aware that his success in Egypt came from God. I don't have any question that Joseph understood that even as he was a prisoner in Potiphar's house, that his success even there was from God. And I have no doubt in my mind that Joseph said, I'm going to keep trusting you despite what may happen. How do I know that? Well, I know that by his response to the baker and the butler. If you want to look back with me there in verse number 8, there towards the end, notice what Joseph says. Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Now, I want to be clear. Joseph is a real person. This is not an allegorical story that Moses put together to be able to teach us some great lessons, and this is outside of human experience, because it's not. If Joseph was not trusting Jesus, he would have said, look, I've had some dreams interpreted for by God, but look where it got me. So you don't want to hear what I have to say? Find somebody else. Or you don't want what my God has to offer. But no, there was something in Joseph that allowed him to keep trusting in Jesus, to keep trusting in God. They said, although my circumstances aren't going like I want them to, there is a God in heaven who can help us understand this. Evidence of his trusting in Jesus. I want you to go down to and I really am hurrying up to quit. I got 60 seconds until I'm really overtime, but you don't pay me overtime, so it doesn't matter. Verse number 23, and I don't have to write it down on the paper because you know it, you're here. That was from earlier, but verse number 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. People may forget you, but Jesus never will. Your circumstances may not work out like you want them to. But because Jesus never forgets you, He's always working things together for your good. And He can use them for His glory. You see, in the midst of being in prison, Joseph was given an administrative task. He was able to hone his administrative skills because God had a specific task for him that required using administrative skills to prepare enough food so that his family could be provided for. And I don't know how your story ends. I don't know what specific purpose God has for you now. But I have no doubt in my mind this morning that whatever it is, it's intended for your good and for His glory. So I'm going to close with this question, and I hadn't planned on doing this. So I guess I'm trying to ask you to excuse me if it doesn't make sense. Okay. That was being a little lighthearted there. So that was a way to cover myself from embarrassment if it didn't work out. But if the circumstances of your life can't be controlled, the people, your job situation, certainly there are things within our control, but most of them are not. Politically in our country, health-related, things going on around the world. Do you want to get to the other side of those circumstances miserable, bitter, angry, wasting a portion of your life? Or do you want to get to the other side of those at peace, knowing that God's done something in your heart, knowing that you have a home with Him forever? And if I could end with a little bit of a lighthearted moment here, just to remind you of my sports illustration before, my favorite team's going to lose. Only one team at the end of the year comes out on top. So I've got a decision. Do I want to get to that time miserable? Or do I want it to flow off like water off a duck's back? My team can't make that decision for me. Only I can. And the same thing's true for you. You've got a decision to make. Are you going to bloom where you're planted? If you're going to do that, you've got to focus on what you can control. You've got to be able to see and be concerned about the well-being of others. But most importantly, you've got to keep trusting Jesus.